I'm holding a photo of hiking boots standing upright in a remote forest, but the person wearing them was literally deleted from existence. These official documents don't exist on any government server, yet they prove that something beneath the national parks is hunting us. If you hear whistling in the woods tonight, it's already too late. Most think a Freedom of Information Act request ends with a digital file. They do not tell you about the documents that officially do not exist, appearing because someone on the inside wants the truth to breathe. I have spent years tracking the missing 411 cases, but I never expected the government to actually blink. I sat at my desk as the morning fog clung to the pine needles. The silence was heavy. Inside the envelope was a stack of 30 pages held by a rusted clip. The first thing that hit me was the ink. Thick black strokes moved across the pages like a blade, reducing paragraphs to a rectangular void. On page 4, a single sentence survived. Subject exhibited signs of molecular displacement prior to acoustic event. My blood turned to ice. You do not find terms like that in a standard search and rescue report. I turned the page, and the phrase that would become my obsession appeared. Subterranean acoustic anomalies. It was linked to coordinates only 60 miles from my cabin, centered on a region known as the Hidden Valley. I was a skeptic, but this was a paper trail leading into a blind spot. I did not know then that the whistling was already beginning. There is a specific point in the Wind River Range where people vanish from inside their own clothes. I spent the evening cross-referencing the redacted coordinates with the established missing 411 maps, and the overlay was a perfect match. The data points centered on a narrow canyon known as Devil's Gate, a location where the laws of physics and the history of search and rescue shatter. In 1999, a 3-year-old boy vanished, walking 10 feet behind his father. His jacket was found 3 days later, zipped up and perfectly folded atop a boulder 2,000 feet higher than where he was last seen. There were no tracks, no struggle, and no scent. The Freedom of Information Act documents filled the gaps. They mentioned a localized pressure drop and a metallic odor that lingered for hours after each person ceased to exist. At Devil's Gate, the granite walls are high quartz, which may hold an electrical charge. According to the internal memo, the expired bodies eventually recovered often show no signs of predation, but their internal organs were in a state of cellular agitation. I packed my thermal gear. Dave, if you go up there, leave your global positioning system at home. It won't help you. The voice on the other end of the burner phone belonged to a retired ranger who had spent 30 years burying things the public was never meant to see. We met at a roadside diner where the lights hum with nervous energy. He sat in the corner booth, eyes darting to the door. He did not ask for my name. Instead, he slid a folded copy of what he called the protocol. It was a set of directives detailing the procedure for when a lifeless person is discovered in a state that defies biological explanation. He told me about the 1980s, a decade where disappearances spiked so sharply that the Department of the Interior sent in specialized units equipped with gear that looked like it belonged on a battlefield. The Park Service is not just a conservation agency, it is a containment board. He described finding hikers who had passed away in a perfect circle, their faces frozen in absolute awe. Omit the official reports, he whispered, because those are just fairy tales. The real truth is hidden in the granite, where radio signals turn to static. As he stood to leave, he gripped my arm with a strength that made my bones ache. He warned me that some secrets follow you home. The silence of the high Rockies is often a warning. As I crossed the 9,000-foot line into the redacted zone, the birds stopped singing, and my compass needle began a slow, rhythmic circle. I had stepped across an invisible threshold into a pocket of the world intentionally removed from the map. I pushed deeper into the timber, my boots crunching on ancient needles that seemed to absorb the sound. The forest here looked wrong. The trees were twisted into unnatural spirals, their trunks scarred by strange geometric patterns. I stopped near a massive fallen cedar and found the first piece of physical evidence. Lodged deep within a split in the wood was a handheld communication device from the 1970s, its plastic casing perfectly preserved but fused into the organic fibers of the tree. It was as if the device and the wood had occupied the same space at the exact same moment. I reached out to touch it, but a sudden sharp vibration in the ground made me pull back. The sensation was not an earthquake, but a focused, subterranean pulse that rattled my teeth. The zone was a living territory beginning to notice my presence. The air turned ice cold, smelling of ozone. I was no longer a traveler. I was a trespasser in a place that did not want to be found. I was not alone, but whatever was tracking me did not have a heartbeat. I checked my thermal scope, but all I saw was a pocket of freezing air, a humanoid cold spot moving through the brush at a high-speed sprint. In the world of optics, heat is life, but this entity appeared as a void of absolute zero, a shifting shadow that absorbed the ambient temperature. I stood perfectly still, my own breath blooming in front of me like a white flag. The failure of my gear was total. The display on my camera flickered with green static, and my flashlight beam seemed to bend. Every time I took a step, I heard bipedal footsteps echoing my own with a terrifying 1-second delay. It was a predatory mimicry designed to keep me uncertain, a psychological game played by something that had mastered being seen without being perceived. The cold spot moved again, circling my perimeter with predatory grace. I realized then that the molecular displacement mentioned in the Freedom of Information Act papers was a cloaking mechanism. The air around the entity rippled like heat haze, distorting the trees into a fractured mosaic. I was staring at a predator, masking its existence by folding the environment around itself. When the footsteps finally stopped, the silence was more violent than any noise could have been. I reached for my knife, but my hand froze as a low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the marrow of my bones. Nature does not build right angles. Tucked behind the curtain of a frozen waterfall, I found a seam in the granite so precise it looked like it had been cut with a laser, matching the entry point description on page 42. The stone was cold, yet when I pressed my palm against it, it felt like a vibration, a rhythmic pulsing that suggested something mechanical was alive deep beneath the mountain's crust. I moved along the cliff face, tracing the hairline fracture that separated the natural world from something engineered. According to government documents, these entry points were located at geodetic nodes, where the magnetic field is thinnest. I found a small indentation near the base, and as I applied pressure, the entire section of the cliff slid backward with a silent, fluid grace. The opening revealed a passage descending at a steep angle, illuminated by a faint, bioluminescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls. I realized the subterranean acoustic anomalies were not coming from the wind, but from this throat in the earth. The floor was littered with modern debris, bits of plastic, a hiker's carabiner, and an official National Park Service Ranger badge that looked as though it had been melted and reshaped. As I stepped across the threshold, the temperature jumped 20 degrees. The door behind me did not slam. It simply merged back into the cliff, leaving me in a silence so absolute it felt like being buried in a tomb. Dropping into that crevice felt like sliding down the throat of the mountain. My flashlight beam cut through a darkness so dense it had physical weight, striking walls that were an intricate gallery of carvings. Thousands of symbols stretched toward the ceiling, depicting star charts that should not be visible from the northern hemisphere. I descended deeper, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something chemical. Beneath my boots, the floor had been polished into a mirror-like sheen that reflected my light in ghostly ribbons. Among the ancient art, I found the wreckage of the modern world. Strewn across a wider chamber were items matching cold cases from the 1990s. A rusted canteen, a tattered nylon backpack, and a single child's shoe, perfectly preserved as if the wearer had simply stepped out of it. The deeper I went, the more the carvings changed, transitioning from stars to disturbing imagery of humanoid figures walking through shimmering doorways. It became clear that this was not merely a cave, but a transit point, a subterranean hub where people were being brought for a purpose. The Freedom of Information Act papers were too terrified to name. I reached the center of the chamber and found a National Park Service marker bolted into the stone, official confirmation that the government had claimed this place. Then, the low-frequency thrum intensified, vibrating through my skull. A rhythmic splashing sounded from a dark tunnel, as if something massive was moving through water. Then, the humming started, a low-frequency thrum that you do not hear with your ears, but feel in your teeth. It is the same infrasound frequency the Freedom of Information Act report claimed caused disorientation, a sound wave so deep it triggers a survival response. My balance wavered, the stone floor seeming to tilt as my inner ear struggled to process a vibration that felt like the mountain itself was purring. The physical effects were immediate. My heart rate accelerated, and a cold sweat broke across my skin, despite the heat. I looked through my camera lens, and the image was warping into strange ripples. This was the acoustic anomaly mentioned in the redacted files, a localized sound wave, or perhaps a byproduct of an engine far too large to comprehend. It created a sensation of absolute dread, a weight that whispered for me to run, to leave the child's shoe behind. I forced myself to keep the camera rolling, even as my muscles began to twitch with involuntary spasms. The air in front of me started to shimmer and fold, refracting my flashlight beam into a spectrum of light that should not exist in the dark. I realized that the frequency was not just meant to frighten, it was a carrier wave intended to thin the veil between the physical and the unknown. Just as the nausea became unbearable, the humming cut out into a silence so sudden it felt like a blow. In the absolute dark, I heard a wet, heavy exhale only 3 feet from the back of my neck. I saw him in the periphery of my light, not a man and not a beast, but a towering silhouette that absorbed the light. He did not growl. He exhaled, and the sound carried the weight of 1,000 years of solitude, a resonant breath that smelled of wet moss and ancient iron. I slowly turned my flashlight, the beam trembling as it climbed up a massive, barrel-shaped chest covered in thick charcoal fur that shimmered with a faint static charge. Standing 9 feet tall, the creature did not move with the frantic energy of an animal, but with a deliberate stillness. The face was a haunting bridge between species, a heavy brow, shaded eyes that glowed with a deep, amber intelligence. There was no aggression in his stance, only a profound, watchful authority, as if I were a microscopic organism being scrutinized under a lens. Every campfire story I had ever dismissed felt like a pale imitation of the presence standing before me. The guardian reached out a hand, wide enough to cover my head, and placed it flat against the carved stone wall. As he did, the star charts began to glow with a pulsing light that matched the frequency of the subterranean hum. I realized then that he was not a resident of this cave. He was the operator. The others described in the Freedom of Information Act papers were maintaining the very infrastructure of the mountain. He looked down at me, his gaze lingering on the camera, and for a split second, the air felt electrified. Then, with a fluid motion that defied his massive scale, he pointed toward a titanium briefcase tucked into a shadowed alcove. Propped against the back wall was a titanium briefcase used for sensitive geodetic surveys. Seeing it there, in a chamber that predates modern civilization, was a jarring collision of worlds. I knelt beside the metal, my fingers fumbling with the latches until they clicked open with a sharp snap. Inside was not a map of the land, but a map of the others, a detailed census of a population that officially does not exist. The documents were stamped with high-level security clearance and printed on official government letterhead, but the content was science fiction. There were topographical overlays of every national park in North America, each marked with blue zones labeled as Species Zero habitats. This was the truth the Freedom of Information Act papers had tried to bury. The Park Service is not protecting people from the wilderness, but is actively protecting these entities from human contact. I turned the pages, finding medical charts and dietary requirements that suggested a long-standing partnership between the federal government and these guardians. One document detailed an agreement to provide restricted land in exchange for geodetic stabilization. It became clear that missing hikers were not always victims of malice. Sometimes they were collateral damage in a high-stakes, ecological contract. The realization that our wilderness system is a managed enclosure for a superior, hidden intelligence made the air feel thinner. As I reached for a folder labeled The Frequency Initiative, a red light began to blink. A digitized voice announced that a security breach had been detected. Dave. The whisper did not come from behind me. It came from the walls, a hollow resonance bleeding out of the stone. It was my own voice, played back with a slight delay, as if the mountain were an ancient recording device learning the phonetics of my name. The mimicry was perfect, but the tone was devoid of life, a hollow shell of sound vibrating in the dark. I swept my flashlight across the chamber, the beam cutting through a sudden fog that smelled of copper. The briefcase continued to blink its frantic warning, but the digitized alarm was now being overtaken by a chorus of voices. I heard the laughter of a child, the shouting of a search party from 20 years ago, and the low, rhythmic chanting of the Guardian. This was the lure mechanism described in the missing 411 files, a sophisticated acoustic trap designed to disorient the human mind by reflecting its own memories and fears back at it. The psychological pressure became a physical weight, pressing against my temples until I saw sparks of fractured light. I realized the cavern was not just a physical space, but a resonant chamber tuned to the human nervous system. The subterranean acoustic anomalies were being used to bridge the gap between my reality and the redacted world of the others. Every sound I made was being absorbed, catalogued, and thrown back at me, stripping away my sense of self. I grabbed the folder from the briefcase and scrambled toward the far tunnel, my own voice now screaming warnings at me from the shadows. The ground beneath me began to tilt at an impossible angle as the hum returned. The hum of the mountain was suddenly drowned out by helicopter blades. They were not search and rescue. The blacked-out airframes and the lack of transponders meant the Freedom of Information Act leak had been a bait. The heavy silence was shattered as strobe lights began to pulse through the entrance, casting long shadows against the ancient star charts. I pressed my back against the granite, clutching the stolen folder as the first tactical boots hit the stone floor. These men moved with surgical efficiency, equipped with night vision goggles and specialized tools that bore no national insignia. They were the containment team, the shadowed arm of the Department of the Interior, tasked with ensuring that the Species Zero habitats remained a secret. I could hear their specialized communication gear chirping, a series of digital clicks that sounded disturbingly similar to the acoustic mimicry of the cavern itself. They were not here to rescue a missing vlogger. They were here to sanitize a security breach. I realized that the retired ranger had been right about the consequence of looking too deep into the black marker voids. The government was not just aware of the entities, they were their armed security. I saw the lead operative signal to the others, his gloved hand pointing directly toward the alcove where I lay, shivering. The mountain began to vibrate again, but this time it was not a hum. It was a roar of displaced air as a secondary unit began to fast rope into the valley. I looked at the dark tunnel behind me, and at the tactical team closing in. I had to choose between the ancient guardians or the modern adversaries. In the chaos of the strobe lights, the silhouette moved, not to attack me, but to shield me. For a split second, the being and the vlogger were on the same side of a very old war. The towering guardian stepped into the center of the chamber, his charcoal fur rippling as he unleashed a vocalization so powerful it shattered the glass of the tactical team's goggles and sent a shockwave through the stone that knocked the armed men to their knees. The creature did not use a weapon. He used the mountain itself. With a single gesture toward the carved ceiling, the bioluminescent glow surged into a blinding white light, and the subterranean hum accelerated into a deafening roar. I watched in absolute awe as the air around the extraction team began to fracture, the molecular displacement manifesting in real time. The operatives scrambled backward, their equipment useless against a force that seemed to be editing the physical properties of the room. The Guardian looked back at me, his amber eyes conveying a silent command to move, and I realized he was the immune system of this valley, a biological barrier against those who sought to weaponize his existence. I scrambled toward a narrow bypass as the chamber began to collapse in a controlled demolition. The Guardian stood his ground, a wall of ancient muscle and static energy, while the mountain groaned under the weight of the coming rockslide. I had witnessed a pact between the earth and its protector, a bond that far superseded any government contract. I was being allowed to live, but the price was the disappearance of the only world I had ever known. I do not remember the climb out, only the feeling of lungs burning and the industrial smell of aviation fuel. I emerged from the crevice into the cold moonlight, just as the valley floor was swallowed by a coordinated rockslide, a thunderous erasure that sealed the entry point under 10,000 tons of granite. The government helicopters were already veering away, their missions aborted as the mountain itself redacted the evidence of the evening's encounter. I collapsed into the grass of the ridge, my hands trembling as I clutched the single folder I had managed to pull from the titanium briefcase. My primary camera had been crushed, but tucked inside my vest was the secure digital card that held the infrared footage of the Guardian. Looking back down into the basin, the hidden valley appeared as nothing more than a peaceful void, hiding the fact that an entire tactical team had just been neutralized by a force they could not even define. The sheer scale of the deception was staggering. The National Park Service had not just been hiding a creature, They were managing a subterranean gateway. The silence that followed was the heavy hush of a witness who knew too much. I checked the stolen documents under the dim glow of a red headlamp, finding a list of names and dates stretching back to 1947, each linked to a specific geodetic node. I was no longer just a vlogger. I was a man carrying a dangerous secret in a world that was already moving to silence me. As the first light touched the peaks, I heard a distant, mimicked bird call that sounded exactly like the ringtone of my phone. I am back in my cabin now, but I do not look at the woods the same way. The Freedom of Information Act. Papers were mostly black ink, but the parts they did not redact are the parts I now see every time I close my eyes. I sit on my porch as the sun dips below the horizon, watching the tree line for a shimmer that has nothing to do with the wind, knowing the missing 411 cases were just the surface of an ancient truth. The folder I took from the mountains sits on my lap, containing the names of hundreds of individuals who have entered the wilderness and never returned. My digital files have been wiped 3 times by remote intrusion, yet the physical secure digital card remains hidden where no signal can reach it. I have come to realize the National Park Service is not an agency of preservation, but a gatekeeper for a subterranean civilization that has lived beneath the Rockies since before the first stone tools were knapped. They are the unseen watchers, the silent operators of the geodetic nodes that keep our world stable, and they're increasingly aware that their secrecy has been compromised by a single man with a camera. The warning on the final page of the file now rings in my mind with clarity. Some things are not meant to be found, and once you have looked into the abyss begins to look back. I am no longer an observer of the mystery. I have become a data point in their next census. As the shadows stretch across my yard, I hear a familiar mimicked bird call coming from the eaves of my own roof. It is the sound of my own front door opening, reproduced with terrifying precision. The whistling has begun again, and this time it is coming from inside the house. The truth has been redacted for decades, but the mountain's memory is longer than any official record. If you have the courage to follow these paper trails into the black marker voids, subscribe and like this video to join our search. Share these findings with those who know the wilderness is not as empty as it seems, and together we will listen for the frequencies they tried to bury. Until next time, stay vigilant, because some secrets aren't just watching you, they're learning your name.